Hey, how are you? Kind of early out here.
So,
You're more the cloud over the sky. Why don't we start with you?
and you can sit if you want.
I actually appreciate it's a good old-fashioned podium instead of electronic ones. They have a deep well.
It's the Miller Center. It's good and old-fashioned.
Yeah.
That's how we roll.
Yeah, except for the media circus.
Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome back to our conference on America First. Its past and its future. I'm Will Hitchcock. I teach in the history department here at the University of Virginia, and I'm thrilled to chair this third panel of our day-long conference. When Mel Leffler and I put this sort of second half of the day together, we really wanted to figure out a way to deal both with the domestic politics, culture, and questions of race and immigration in a significant way. So we created a panel around that theme, but we also knew that there was something about America First that wouldn't make sense if we didn't examine the global economy in some depth as well. So we decided to separate out these two issues, although they are, of course, closely intertwined. So we're going to start this afternoon with a panel on the global economy and the way it's shaped the arguments about America First in our contemporary politics. And you are very lucky to have such a sterling pair of panelists here this afternoon to carry us through the global economy in the age of globalization, really focusing on the period from the 1970s onward. So I'll just introduce our two speakers and then I'll get out of the way. Jefferson Cowie is the James Stallman Chair in the Department of History at Vanderbilt University. He's to my immediate right, and he's the author of The Great Exception, The New Deal and the Limits of American Politics. And his remarks will examine workers and their position in and their response to the America First problem and the problem of globalization broadly defined. And then he'll be followed by Mike Froman, who is a distinguished public servant. He served under President Barack Obama as the U.S. Trade Representative and as an assistant to the President and Deputy National Security Advisor for International Economic Affairs. It doesn't say so on our bio, but I think you are the author, essentially, of the TPP. Is that fair to say? You are one of the principal.
I get blamed for it.
Yeah, that's right. So like it or love it, this is your era. So we have someone here who really knows what it's like on the inside to work through these very thorny questions of international trade, and he can help illuminate that debate for us. He's been affiliated with the Miller Center this year as the James Schlesinger Distinguished Professor at the Miller Center, and it's been a wonderful privilege to get to know him during this year. So I'll turn it over to Jeff to get us started. Thank you.
Thanks, and thanks again to all the organizers and for what's been a great morning, and I hope we don't let you down for the afternoon. And throughout the morning, I was really impressed by the number of threads that I think are running through everything in the morning and then on into what I'm going to talk about and what I've already read about for the afternoon. So I think the cohesion here is strong. And the morning started with Mel asking us about the sort of combination of resurrection versus continuity in this question of America First. And I think if you look at kind of working class America, which is what I study, and I think you see a lot of continuity in this since the 1970s. If the heart of kind of the more populist version of America First, I think speaks to a sense of betrayal about one's birthright. Somebody somewhere sold you out, done you wrong. And I think for much of the American working class, that sentiment is very much alive. The structure of feeling within this, the variety of communities of working people, I think, is fragmented and fractured, but there's an underlying anxiety and fear and anger that goes with it. And the title of the conference is also Past and Future. I'm going to talk about the past and make maybe some suggestions about the future. So, for me, there's sort of few things that capture the sense of rage and impotence, in a way, of workers in the global age than in the early 80s. You could go to a picnic at the United Auto Workers would hold in Michigan and other places, and for a small donation, you could take a sledgehammer and smash a Toyota Corolla with the sledgehammer. And as satisfying as that might be, it obviously does not necessarily lead to any policy solutions. The other things that were going on were Buy American campaigns. You'd go into the parking lots of manufacturing establishments, you'd see Buy American, the job you may save is your own. Or as I was a young graduate student in the 90s doing research in my Subaru, I had to park it 6 blocks away from the plant or the union office and walk in so that nobody knew I drove a foreign car. And if you were actually an employee at an auto plant, you had to park your car, your foreign-made vehicle, way out at the end of the lot, not near the plant gates, which was reserved for American-made vehicles. So you have these symbolic nationalist responses to the emerging transnational economy in the 1970s. And while they tended to event more emotion than they did create policy, I think what the election of 2016 suggests is that we dismiss that resentment at our peril. And I also want to drive home the fact that this is not, that the America First paradigm is actually not necessarily, while it resonates in a sort of deep, visceral way with these workers, it's not necessarily that useful in a way in the immediate sense. Consider, for instance, non-Japanese transplants, which are Japanese auto firms in the United States. Are those American? It's American made, I suppose, but it's a Japanese company. The fact that some of the best union contracts and best paid workers in the world were from Sweden and Germany. So, if you wanted to shoot for the higher standards, you had to actually look at these other places. But what they did was kind of prove more powerful than a cosmopolitan dream of transnational labor solidarity with union sisters and brothers united around the world. I mean, I think this ends up being a little bit of a wisp in the trade winds, really, when it's right here, right now, this job, this community that's being affected. So the old lines between us and them, between workers and bosses, gets quite confused in the 1970s, 1980s, and into the 1990s. And Robert Reich, I think the former Secretary of Labor, before he was Secretary of Labor, mapped out the confusion really clearly in a pair of smart Harvard Business Review articles in 1990 and 1991 with the revealing titles, Who is Us and Who is Them? And I think that remains the core central problem for kind of working class identity in this age. And when it comes to working class America, especially the volatile Midwestern white working class, but not only them by any stretch of the imagination, there has been a real and genuine fall. There is a real and genuine sense of betrayal. And it's not mere anxiety, paranoia, racism, or metaphor. It's real. American workers, especially of the industrial variety, enjoyed a privileged position in the global economy in the post-war era. Recipients of much of the bounty of trade liberalization under GATT, labor actually supported agreements like the Trade Expansion Act of 1962. But merely a dozen years later, foreign cars, foreign electronics, foreign steel, garments, and more to the point, offshoring of domestic brands began to rattle the post-war trade regime. And the new order of things became apparent when, in 1974, when a garment strike erupted in an El Paso garment factory owned by Willie Farah, and he came out and said, get back to work because there are, quote, 2 billion foreigners out there willing to work for 10 cents an hour unless you, that are willing to take your jobs. So, not surprisingly, when the post-war settlement begins to unravel, workers sought to reestablish control over the globalizing labor market. And they did so, I want to argue, with a nationalist, America First set of policies. And here we see something that we've talked about a little bit this morning, which is not America First as a specific clause that speaks directly back to the America First Committee or something like that, but a spirit of this moment that is really important. And I also want to make the argument that this is mostly backward-looking for American workers. I make the analogy that it's akin to farmers who seek the parity doctrine based on the pre-World War I agricultural golden age. We want to get back to whatever that was. And there's a whole host of policies, the Burke-Hartke foreign trade investment proposal that sought to impose quotas and eliminate tax provisions for overseas investments, and the International Ladies Garment Workers Union pounding the look for the union label jingle on television ads, Buy American campaigns. Then when the steel mills started to go down, campaigns for industrial policy to save steel. Others looked to the Humphrey Hawkins Full Employment Act that was voted on in 1978, which would have guaranteed a job to anybody who wanted one. Anti-dumping agreements, currency manipulation, voluntary trade restrictions, a whole host of kinds of restrictions in various ways to protect American industry and American jobs. Unlike the sort of McKinley-era tariffs that we talked about earlier, in which the Republican Party was protectionist in favor of protection in favor of tariffs to protect industry, this is different, in which the workers and industry are not necessarily aligned on the tariff question. So battle lines began to emerge between sort of a laissez-faire cosmopolitan outlook and working people who are grounded in place and time. And the problem I want to present, and the problem I think that Donald Trump exploits, is to paraphrase Tip O'Neill, the fact that all working class politics are national. So in 1979, when Ronald Reagan launched his candidacy for the presidency, he declared himself in favor of a new idea. He called it at the time the North American Accord on Trade and Development, an idea that would eventually be signed in 1992 as the North American Free Trade Agreement. And what was interesting, I thought, about the way Reagan presented this is he simultaneously had this populist magic that allowed him to maintain a rally around the flag kind of cultural politics while simultaneously ushering in an era of a global market in commodities and labor. And then as the 1980s progressed, obviously labor's rights weakened after PATCO and the rest, leaving industrial workers sort of flapping in the trade winds with little more than being born in the USA. Labor countered NAFTA with essentially a nationalist campaign. Their argument around NAFTA was just say no. It wasn't an alternative. It wasn't. It was essentially a large, big, I would argue, self-righteous America First rally without the phrase America First. Occasional flickers of transnational connections between Canadian and Mexican workers, but by and large, this was let's turn back the clock, let's go back before this happened, largely ignoring the fact that hundreds of thousands of jobs had already gone across the border in various ways. The long period of silent integration that had already happened with Mexico was evident throughout the border zone through the maquiladoras and other things. The battle in Seattle in 1999 suggested perhaps the beginning of a more global consciousness for workers, but it never really took root in American political culture. So just saying no to trade proposals turned out to be much easier than confronting the problem of the late 20th century, which is the globalization of the labor market. Now, usher in the New Democrats. NAFTA could not have been passed without a Democrat like Bill Clinton, leaving no vote unturned in an aggressive campaign to rebrand his party as something new. And what this meant was leaving the blue-collar base of the Democratic Party without economic representation. And as a result, the white working class punished Democrats and the Clintons for betraying that birthright and turned to Republicans for bolstering their cultural values. And if you go into the Midwest today, NAFTA and Clinton remain toxic terms throughout the Midwest. So the Democrats then stumbled upon the problem that tripped up many reformist and social democratic parties around the world. And that is, and this is something Obama was keenly aware of during his 2008 campaign, I think, that is jumping on a cosmopolitan, laissez-faire global position that denied the central fact that the nation state was and would remain the place where workers' rights are recognized and wealth redistribution can happen. So social democracy, where liberals make their mark, is a national project. It cannot be robust if capitulating to the transnational order is the essence of the political agenda. The nation remains the imagined community, I think, for most working class people. Now, one critic, he was looking specifically actually at the German Social Democrats, identified this problem as the following. He quoted, and I quote, "The convenient self-delusion of the neoliberal decades that you could strengthen both national democracy, including welfare state capitalism, and transnational policymaking." This stands in contrast to the post-war era when we talked about where we had both a liberal international agenda and a strong liberal state at home. So rural development advocate Dee Davis, I think, from West Virginia, captured this tension quite well. He said, "We now take our identity more and more by what we used to do. We used to be farmers. We used to be loggers. We used to work at the plant. Well, in this area, we used to be coal miners. And now an invisible geographic wall of economic opportunity separates the urban centers of dynamism and the dead zone beyond. Without anything real besides decreasing life expectancy, hollowed out towns, and drug dependency to replace these once vibrant manufacturing locations. And this much vaunted Schumpeterian process of creative destruction has largely been replaced by the politics of resentment." So the lessons of Trump's America First appeal, I want to clutch down to the local social level, not necessarily the foreign policy level. And make the argument it's not that white workers are irredeemably provincial or racist, though many are, but that the nation state remains the only imaginable place of redress, even in a global age. Backward-looking nationalism and populism of the American First variety are on the rise internationally, but they need to be framed as a reaction to a claustrophobic global determinism that mocks national governments, mocks political identity, and the capacity for people to act on their own and on their community's behalf. So for me, I'm curious, and I think David Farber's talk left off here, and I'll grab this baton, is there anything like what Walter Lippmann once called enlightened nationalism? A national vision that would allow some sort of national politics without succumbing to the ugliness that we often associate with America first and or nationalism more broadly. So ethnocentric or racial nationalism needs to be feared, but the concept of shared national commitment, I think, might be able to be harnessed. I think we are at a paradigm shift in American politics. I think 2016 is going to mark that because what came to roost was this 30-year neglect of blue-collar America. And the possibility of a dynamic, outward, forward-looking national economic strategy might be able to draw the United States away from this sort of what may be emerging as a kind of neo-mercantilist competition between the U.S., China, and Russia. Maybe we can think about national development policies. Maybe we can think about infrastructure. That was one of the most exciting things I thought about Trump's election. A green revolution sponsored by the national government. But the key to transcending this sort of backward-looking protectionism or an attempt to capture the labor market at any one moment requires looking forward, finding a way not to just harness off the past of some golden age, but that you want to return to, but in fact finding ways to make the energy that's around the nation state move forward in a positive way. Gary Gerstle, in his book The American Crucible, claims there's a useful, if elusive and complex, quote, history of civic nationalism in the United States that promises economic opportunity and political freedom to all citizens, irrespective of their racial, religious, or cultural background. And this is, of course, playing with fire. The obvious nature of race and citizenship in America being so racialized. So the puzzle, I think, is not that complicated, but I think it is elusive. I think it's clear what needs to happen, but how to do it becomes problematic. Any kind of nation-based civics is messy, and it needs to be distinguished somehow from white nationalist identity. But progressives have conceded the fight for fear of the dark side of the problem. And I think embracing a cosmopolitan, laissez-faire vision isn't going to do the trick, especially while the Trump wing conservatives have cloaked themselves in this sort of blood and soil nationalism and really literally claiming to take you backward to a time when making America great again was a possibility. So I want to have it both ways here a little bit. I want to say that there's some political space for moving forward in terms of national identity. It can't just be dismissed, and if it is dismissed, we do so in a very, I think, dangerous way. And to not recognize the pragmatic dimensions of placing American workers in some sort of national developmental vision is to invite desperate and empty calls to make America great again, or America first. Thanks.
Well, thanks very much for having me. And let me just thank the Miller Center more generally. It's been a great year to be associated here, and I've certainly learned a lot by being here. And I was delighted to be here during at least part of the morning panel. I thought it teed up the trade issues really very well. You know, I think when it comes to America First, on its face, it's not a particularly remarkable concept when it comes to trade. I think every country puts their interests first. I don't think you'd find a president who said they thought that their job was to put America second or third or fourth. And they certainly were all acting as though they were pursuing America's interests first. The question is, how do you define America's interests? President Trump's advisors, now it used to be McMaster and Cohen, wrote these two articles. Both of them are now gone, of course, but I assume the theory still holds. They defended America First by arguing that there was no such thing as an international community, that we cooperate where we have common interests with other countries, we compete with them, we conflict with them where we don't. And again, there's nothing on its face that's particularly remarkable about that. That is basically a statement of realism to a certain degree. On the other hand, it suggests a very transactional view of international relations rather than a vision that we are pursuing our national interests through international cooperation based on some sense of shared values and purpose. It doesn't mean that we always agree with our partners on every issue, but that we're working towards some common set of objectives. After all, international relations is the ultimate reiterative, multidimensional, ongoing negotiation. It's an effort to work with other parties across multiple transactions. And for the last 75 years, we've defined U.S. interests largely in enlightened terms. We supported an international system that we thought reflected our values and our interests. and that we promoted collective action consistent with those values. Not a Hobbesian unilateral view of the international system, but one where we work through alliances and regional trade agreements, multilateral regimes to pursue our common values, but also to pursue our national interests. And by opening up our economy, sometimes asymmetrically, sometimes disproportionately, we helped lead to the reconstruction of Japan and Europe after the Second World War. We helped developing countries become emerging markets. We created a middle class around the world that were markets for our exports. We became a major exporting market. And we helped facilitate the most significant reduction in poverty in human history. And those are all achievements of the international system itself. But this didn't come without its costs. And there were free riders on the system, or participants who did not pay their share of the system. In the 1980s and the 1990s, it was Japan who benefited enormously from access to our markets and other markets around the world while keeping their market closed. Korea to a certain extent. Now it's China. And China's become the archetypal example of the international free rider. And for some time before Trump, this has been an issue of great concern to Democrats and Republicans alike about how do we create a more level playing field between ourselves and the rest of the world, bearing in mind exactly as Jeff said, that there is this globalization of the labor market force. Now, President Trump has said that they don't mean America first to be America alone. But that depends, of course, it's not entirely within our control. It depends on whether anybody else follows us, whether we're alone or not. There is a desire for the United States to be engaged, for the United States to show leadership, even though among those countries that resent us when we throw our weight around, the only thing they resent more than our leadership is our absence. And they very much want us to be engaged. And as Bob Kagan and I were discussing during the break, there's an active effort around the world to figure out how to accommodate the United States, how to work with this president, how to create deals and make this work for them, because, and we see this with President Macron's visit just this week, there's a great desire that the United States come back to the table. But whether it's pulling out of agreements like the TPP or the Paris Accord, threatening to pull out of agreements like NAFTA or Chorus or the Iran deal, questioning fundamental elements of our military alliances like Article 5 of the NATO treaty, all of that has raised real questions about U.S. leadership and reliability as a partner, and may create some ongoing change in the nature of our role in the world post this administration. The rest of the world is certainly not standing still waiting for us. When it comes to trade, for example, the United States pulled out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership. The other 11 countries have decided to proceed without us. And there are other countries that want to join the agreement once those 11 are done. The EU just announced last week the completion of a negotiation with Mexico on a new free trade agreement there. They've negotiated with Vietnam, with Singapore, with Canada, of course, with Japan. They're actively negotiating with Australia and New Zealand and Mercosur and ASEAN and India and the Gulf Cooperation Council. They're continuing to move ahead. The Pacific Alliance in Latin America, really quite an interesting example of international integration, international cooperation, continues to deepen and broaden their cooperation. Even in Africa, which has not always been the most liberal sort of economic policy center, you see progress towards a tripartite and a continental-wide free trade agreement. Now, one of the early agendas for this conference had my talk labeled something else and wanted me to talk about America First and NAFTA and TPP. So I thought I would go back to that for a minute, because I think it's really quite indicative of what's going on and the different ways you can pursue U.S. interests under different views of the international system. I think if your view of trade is basically as a zero-sum game, if your view is that exports represent revenues and imports represent costs, and you look at the trade balance, and if you're running a deficit, you're losing money, and if you're running a surplus, you're making a profit, then by definition you have a bit of a zero-sum game in mind. And we see in the current renegotiation of NAFTA, right now as we speak, as I left Washington this morning, all my former colleagues and their colleagues from Canada and Mexico are locked in a room at the Winder building trying to figure out how to define an automobile for the purpose of NAFTA benefits, something called rules of origin. It's the most archaic area of trade negotiation across the board. But the fundamental view is we want Mexico to close down factories and for those factories to move back to the United States. That is the fundamental goal of the administration. It's an understandable goal. We all want to drive more economic activity to our countries, have more workers employed in good jobs, high-wage jobs, in manufacturing jobs if possible. But there is a zero-sum element to this particular exercise. Contrast it with the approach we took in TPP. And certainly through TPP, we were trying to exert whatever national advantage we could possibly get out of the trade agreement. But there, the mechanism was by getting other countries to agree to a set of rules, whether it was about disciplining state-owned enterprises, raising labor and environmental standards, establishing rules for the new digital economy, rules that reflected our interests and our values. And we were criticized for this because the view was we were compromising our sovereignty by agreeing to a multilateral or plurilateral agreement that other countries had equal rights in. But I think another way of looking at that, this is the ultimate exercise of sovereignty. If you can get other countries to sign on and be bound by your values and your interests. And it's not zero sum in that we think that these rules are to the benefit of certainly ourselves and our companies and our workers and our ranchers and farmers, but also to the international system as a whole. Dale's not here, but he raised, I think, a very important question this morning about what is Trump doing? Is it to enhance his negotiating leverage? Or is he really being protectionist? And I actually believe President Trump when he says he is a free trader. He just thinks people like me have negotiated very bad deals in the past, and that he's going to negotiate better deals. And I think he is quite transactional in that regard, that by taking these steps, whether it's announcing tariffs on steel and aluminum or announcing tariffs against China for their intellectual property rights practices, I think his goal is to enhance negotiating leverage precisely to reach better agreements. But he is approaching it in terms of this transactional win-lose element, much more so than actually raising standards and getting other countries to adopt our sort of rules. Ironically, I believe the Trump administration is making America great again by being more Chinese. And actually following China's model of being the country that benefits from the international system, but defines the national interests in the most narrow way possible. China gets great credit for being very disciplined about pursuing its national interests, narrowly defined, in a very coherent and, as I said, disciplined manner, not paying the cost of the international system, not compromising their interests, their short-term interests, for the strength of the overall system. And the question is, and that's I think the approach that the Trump administration has embarked upon, the question is, if we're not there to show leadership and to be the defenders of the system, which we have benefited enormously from, as has the rest of the world, who will be there in our stead? Will it be the Europeans? Will it be the Japanese? Will it be the Chinese? Will they step up and suddenly really defend the global international system? Not in some cynical way where somebody goes to Davos and says, we're free traders, but actually through policy begins to do the hard work of strengthening and expanding international cooperation. It remains to be seen. And that leads to all sorts of questions about global governance, whether we're in we used to be in a G7 or G8 and a G20 world where countries came together to manage difficult issues. Are we in a G2 world? Are we in a G1 world? Are we in a G0 world, as Ian Bremmer says, where there's really no leader and therefore very little new that gets done in the international system? Having said all that, it's not an entirely dark picture. And one thing I wanted to comment on from this morning is about the notion of the American public and populism. If you look at polls, and take a look at the Pew Foundation polls, which is quite a good longitudinal collection of polls over the years, more people, over 70% of the American public, think trade is good now than since the 1970s. More people believe that. And while the American public has long understood that trade is good from a consumer perspective, cheaper products, greater diversity of products, a majority now, 56%, believe that it's good from the perspective of increasing the number of jobs and increasing wages. And so now there's an intensity issue. The people who don't believe that feel much more intensely about that, and Jeff's point about the labor movement in particular feel much more intently about that than the people who do believe that. The people who don't believe that will often organize or vote on that basis, or the people who do believe the trade is good rarely vote on that basis. But it is interesting how this has evolved over time. The most pro-trade cohort in the American public are young Democrats. The least pro-trade cohort are middle-aged Republicans. And the lines are continuing, the trajectories are continuing to diverge. I think on the other side of this, though, I think the point that Jeff made about taking these concerns seriously is absolutely right. And we are continuing to read and write analyses of the 2016 election and what was really going on there. How much of it was economic and how much of it is cultural. We've seen some recent reports out just in the last week or two that are quite interesting on the non-economic elements of what we saw in the last election. But the fact is, there is a significant portion of the United States, whether Trump had won or not, and long after Trump is no longer president, who fundamentally believe that the system isn't working for them. And while economists will tell us that 80%, most economists will tell us that 80% of the impact on wages and jobs are from technology, not from trade. Globalization does play a role. The foreigner does play a role. As somebody said this morning, it's very easy to blame the foreigner. You don't get to vote on technology. You don't get to vote on the next generation of robotics. You don't really get to vote on globalization. Globalization is a force. It's the reflection of technological development, the spread of broadband around the world, the containerization of shipping. You do get to vote on trade. And so trade ends up becoming the scapegoat for other quite legitimate and real economic insecurities, even if it's a minor contributor to the overall issue. And one thing that I think is noteworthy is if we saw the kind of anger and resentment in the 2016 election that occurred at a time of 4.3% unemployment, 15.5 million new jobs, 2.5% wage growth annually for a couple of years. Imagine rolling the calendar forward at a time when artificial intelligence and robotics and automation put some number of significant jobs at risk in the United States. There's a great debate over whether it's 47% or 11%, but whatever the right number is, I'm not sure anybody knows, it's certainly going to be the case that more jobs will be put at risk because of technology going forward than we've seen in recent years, and more quickly than we've seen in recent years. What kind of anger and resentment are we going to see there if we don't address these problems seriously? And there's been a complete failure of political leadership, I would say, from both sides of the aisle, because we have not seen the kind of attention to the policies that would help prepare our people to succeed in a rapidly changing economy, or would help individuals or communities that are adversely affected by rapid change transition and adapt to that change. And quite to my surprise, post-2016 election, there's been almost no real political tension or political will behind doing anything about that. And again, it's not about trade. I think trade is the tail wagging the dog on this one. But as a country, if we don't get our arms around that, the kind of populism that we talked about this morning and the impetus towards American firstism, anti-foreigner, blame the immigrant, blame the global economy, but you don't blame technology. And at the same time, that's probably what will have the most significant impact on us going forward. Thanks.
Thanks to you both. We are going to go for 35 more minutes until 2:15. Then we're going to call this just a little bit early to accommodate our panelists. But what I'd like to do is ask each of you one question, and then I'll throw it open. if that's okay. And then I also want to try to get you talking to each other, because I think that will be an interesting conversation if possible. Jeff, let me start with you just by coming back to this is a labor history question from someone who knows nothing about this, but your opening vignette had UAW workers at a picnic slamming a Toyota Corolla with a sledgehammer, and that's a very powerful and a wonderful image. And my question is just, why was it that the Toyota Corolla and the Subaru you were driving were the enemy? That is to say, why was it foreigners that were the enemy and not capitalism? And maybe capitalism was also the enemy, but it was easier to hit a Toyota Corolla. How did they?
Yeah, you're tapping into the deepest question in labor history, which is why is Class Consciousness weak in America? Right? I mean,
could you answer that, please? We have 60 seconds.
The famous question posed by Werner Sombart, the German sociologist in 1904, is why is there no socialism in America? And everybody's been grinding, and it's not socialism in the sort of even revolutionary sense, but why is social democracy weak? Why is municipal ownership weak? Why is, railroads, state-owned railroads, whatever the case may be, subsidies, welfare, why don't we have national health insurance? Things like this. And so this is an age-old question, and it has as many explanations as it has practitioners of the fine art of labor history. But it often goes to the fragmentation of working class people by ethnicity, by race, and by region. And of course, so if you are reflexively charged to sort of see your economic problems as an expression of immigrants, of black people, of whatever it might be, it's very easy to deflect that resistance away from capital and towards others. Mm-hmm. And so essentially, I think the tragedy of American working class has been it tends to eat itself alive rather than look towards
But
business.
Tell me, and I really don't know, was there always a tension in the labor movement to say, no, really, the problem is capitalism, guys. Let's focus on
Oh,
these
yeah,
complex
of course.
issues.
Yeah,
There were always
yeah.
those who were pushing for a more
absolutely.
sophisticated
Oh,
explanation.
Of course.
But then there was always an effort to say, well, it's really that Toyota out there that's killing us.
Right. I mean, and of course, we've been talking about Franklin Roosevelt a little bit. The extraordinary moment is the rise of the CIO in the mid-30s, in which, union density went from negligible to 35.5% of all non-agricultural workers, and played an enormously powerful role in government, in politics, in collective bargaining, and in the redistribution of wealth. And that is now a political vacuum. There is no space for the representation of working people in either party, in their economic interests in either party, or in the plant, or whatever, the workplace.
By the way, I'm sure if you gave them a chance to take the hammer to a group of bankers, they might have been.
Some of the bankers up in the parking lot. All right, I'm sure we'll come back to those themes.
Spoken like a true banker.
Mike, if I could ask you just a kickoff question, I'm sure we'll come back to these themes as we open it up. So Jeff says that the New Democrats, Clinton in particular, NAFTA, maybe Obama, he didn't really talk about Obama, maybe TPP are the enemy, and that they sold out the American worker. And you obviously, I think, in your remarks, you took the global view, and I think, and told a good story about the way in which globalization is actually an opportunity for American values and interests to be pursued. And you didn't exactly say what those values and interests are or how contested they are, but nonetheless, I think you told a somewhat different story. And I just wonder, again, this is a layman's question. Tell us, as I'm sure you've told countless audiences, is it true that NAFTA, TPP, and similar global trade agreements help or harm the American worker?
Help.
Okay, thank you.
I mean, look, I think.
But tell us why. Because the perception is just the opposite.
Right. And look, this is where being a pragmatist, I think, has certain virtues. I take the world as it is, not as you sort of want it to be, and then try and figure out how to improve upon it. If you're going to read TPP, often criticized for being so long, it's 5,300 pages long. But if you're going to read one piece of it, read the 12-page Vietnam Labor Consistency Plan. It's a remarkable document. This is what we negotiated with Vietnam about the kind of reforms they would need to adopt, a communist country, one-party state, one labor union labor market, for them to become part of TPP and to gain the benefits of TPP. And they agreed to allow free unions that could elect their own leaders, control their own finances, strike, affiliate with who they wanted to, as a price of getting into TPP. It's using the leverage of a trade agreement to get countries to reform. And now, we do that for two reasons. One, because of the inherent dignity of work and wanting to improve workers' rights around the world. And two, in a very America First way, to level the playing field between our workers and the workers that they're competing with abroad. It's a twofer. But with the absence of TPP or those kinds of agreements, now we compete against a Vietnam that has no free labor unions, that doesn't have, they agreed to set a minimum wage, to have workplace regulations, to prohibit discrimination in the workplace, all sorts of things that to allow collective bargaining, all the things that we have been pursuing around the world that reflect our values. We use the leverage of trade agreements to get, because they were trade related and because they were good in and of themselves. And I say oftentimes that I spend an enormous amount of time with the labor movement and with their supporters in Congress going through this in detail. This is the sort of way that we use our tools like trade to bring our values and our interests into these other countries. I'll tell you, as we were negotiating TPP, Speaker Pelosi asked that we come up and brief the House Democratic Caucus about some of the most sensitive chapters. And we went up and we briefed them on what we were seeking in the labor chapter, including the Vietnam Consistency Plan. And by the way, there's a consistency plan for Malaysia having to do with trafficking of workers. There's one with Brunei. And we had a whole series of agreements with Mexico about how to improve the situation in Mexico, which the current administration is now still trying to negotiate what we had already gotten agreed to in the previous agreement. When I laid out for them, and I went up with Tom Perez, who was the labor secretary, when we went up there and laid out for them what it is we were seeking, the response in the room, they literally laughed at us. And they said, there's no way you're going to get that. That would be a game changer if it were to happen. Those were the words they used. Well, the truth is, I only briefed them on 80% of what we were asking for. Because I knew if I came back with anything less than that, they would say, well, you failed. We got 100% of what we asked for. We got more than I briefed them on. And that still was being criticized by the labor movement and their supporters in Congress as not enough. So I think the real question is, what are we doing now to improve workers' rights around the world? What are we doing now to level the playing field for American workers? Would American workers have been better off if we were able to, with real leverage, including enforceable by trade sanctions provisions, held Vietnam and Mexico and Malaysia and Brunei's feet to the fire and made sure that their workers had a minimum wage and had the same kind of rights that we expect of workers everywhere? Would we have been better off? Would our workers have been better off, most importantly? I think the answer is yes.
So that's a remarkable, yes,
do
yes,
just a
please,
quick-
yes.
yeah, 'cause I
Yes,
think-
please, no, absolutely.
Yeah, I think I got conflated personally with my subject. I think the binary between free trade and not free trade is completely false, like most binaries are. The question is on what terms, who's involved, and that's what you're deeply, deeply involved with, and I think that's great. The problem is workers and the way they've mobilized has really been this nationalist approach, which I think is absolutely wrong too. The bottom line is, wages have been stagnant for 40 years in America, right? We know this. Working people, if you don't have a college education and you work for a wage, you haven't had a raise in 40 years. There's a good chance you don't have health care if, at least prior to Obamacare. And so that's what people are angry about, and they're venting on these questions of trade. I completely agree with you, and I wouldn't want to, I'm not an anti-trade by any stretch of the imagination. What I am anti is that the way the economy worked is essentially rigged for most working people. So when you say our values, I'm not sure who's the our in our values that's represented by the USTR. You want to answer?
I think I think that's a very good question, and I think the point that you made about the globalization of labor markets. I mean, the globalization has had a depressing effect on wages in the United States, and like every other industrialized country, the percentage of the workforce that works in manufacturing has declined. If oftentimes we're compared to Germany, and people say, oh, Germany must be doing something right. They have a robust manufacturing sector. Workers are much happier there. If you look at the percentage of workers in Germany who are in manufacturing, the line is almost identical to ours. And it's happened since 1960. It has nothing to do with trade agreements. It's been happening as a natural force of automation. We produce more manufactured products in America right now than we ever have in our history. More cars, more machinery. We do it with about 5 million fewer workers than we did 15 years ago. And again, that's largely because these factories are much more automated than they used to be and require far fewer workers. And that's had a real impact, I think, exactly the kind of impact you've had on people not getting wages increased, having fewer benefits, migrating to service-related jobs that may not have the benefits that their manufacturing jobs had. And that's the real concern that I think we need to address as a country. USTR represented, at least when I was there, everybody's interests. Our view was we were going to leave nobody behind. So we spent lots of time working with labor and environmental groups, agriculture, manufacturing, services, across lots of advocacy groups, transparency groups, anti-corruption groups, animal rights groups, you name it, to try and make sure we were taking everyone's views into consideration. We I think, satisfied the vast majority of them, but not everybody.
I'll just throw it open, I think, to questions, but I just wanted to comment, if I'm hearing you right, Mike, that there's a very robust statement on behalf of what we've been calling internationalism, and essentially what you've said is the fate and well-being of the American worker is actually linked to the fate and the well-being of all workers in a global economy. And if you have rules that govern that global economy, that American workers will benefit. You cannot improve the fate of the American worker without doing the same thing at the same time around the world. So that's an argument that would have blended well with the most ambitious of internationalists of the post-war period, but which has been undercut, I think, and here's my sort of question to you, is why has that argument been so hard to make? Why did they laugh you out of the room when you went up there and said, hey, we live in a global economy? And the implication of what you're saying is that the America First argument that you can actually just ignore the world and improve American standards of living on our own is a fraud. I mean, that's really what you're saying. It's a fraudulent scheme. It's not a choice between two rational objectives. In fact, one is fraudulent. I mean, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I am.
You did. I don't think I used that word, but look, I think that setting up the straw man that you have laissez-faire free trade on one hand and American first protectionism on the other hand is too easy. It's too binary. Certainly when candidate Obama was running for president, he talked about the need to renegotiate NAFTA, just like President Trump. He didn't talk about pulling out of it as President Trump did, but he talked about the importance of renegotiating it. That's what we did in TPP because Mexico and Canada were part of it. We just wrapped it in a broader thing and solved all the issues that we saw with Mexico and Canada, including labor rights in Mexico, through TPP. Now, some people, the Cato Institute did an analysis of TPP, and they gave us, on the whole, a passing grade, a libertarian Cato Institute. But they were worried. They were critical of us for not being free trade enough because we were focused on labor, environment, transparency, good governance, better regulation, all these other things that they viewed as, you seem to be trying to raise standards around the world beyond where the free market might take it. Yes, guilty as charged. So I don't think it's as easy as to saying, you either are in the free trade laissez-faire camp or you've got to close your market. The question is, how do you use, one, can you really build a wall around the United States and pretend that the rest of the world doesn't exist? And by protectionism, are you going to just hurt the very people that you're hoping to help? Whether, not just as consumers, who will obviously be hurt, and the rising cost of the things that they buy and making that, their paychecks go further. But the downstream auto workers who rely on the imported steel and aluminum to produce globally competitive automobiles again. We export 500,000 automobiles to the rest of the world. What's going to happen when our automobiles are now 10% more expensive? Do they think they're going to buy our automobile versus somebody else's? I mean, those are the kinds of issues I think we have to look at. Are we actually helping the people that we seek to help? And I think the alternative way is to use our power, and we do have a lot of power, probably more than people expect, to use our power through these international engagements to raise standards elsewhere around the world. And that's another way of leveling the playing field.
But it has not worked in 2 generations. I mean, it has not. I think trade has worked, but it hasn't worked to elevate workers' wages in the United States. And the line between productivity and wages is fried. I mean, you were taught that there was a linear relationship between those. It doesn't work. And there's been a downward harmonization. There will naturally be, and that's part of an adjustment period, and I think it's totally acceptable. But that's why I think thinking about the nation as a political space where you could do other things unrelated, and this is not my argument, unrelated to trade. Like trade is going to happen, and I think you should be very vigorous about labor and environmental standards in that. But the building of infrastructure, the taking care of healthcare, in a vision that that provides a sense of identity. That's kind of where I'm going in the face of this anti-globalization sentiment.
Let's see. I'm going to go with Jeff, and then Mel, and Philip. Philip, and then I come to the. Actually, yes. Jeff, go ahead. We'll wait till the mic comes. I think we will need it. Yeah.
Thanks. Great presentation, both of you. Terrific. It made me think of 2 authors I read a while ago. One was Alan Ehrenholt, who wrote a book called The Lost City, and the other one was Christopher Lasch. Both of them writing about the working class in different ways. And both of them kind of making the case that there actually was a golden age for the American working class. It was the 1950s. And part of what made it a golden age was not just an increase on prosperity from obviously the Depression, but in some ways the limits of how life was lived. The working man would go to the factory that wasn't going to move somewhere else in search of a lower, higher profit margin, lower costs. It had been there a long time. It was in the community. It was going to stay. The job was not unfamiliar. It required, basically basic education. He made enough to afford his wife to stay home with the kids. He didn't have a whole lot of choice. None of the family didn't have a lot of choice. They had 3 television channels. They had kind of the same goods that everyone else ate. But the owner of the factory didn't make a lot more than they did. The middle class was not significantly better off. The baseball player on the team wasn't going to go somewhere else as a free agent in search of a higher salary. And it was a more predictable world. Change came, but it came at a sort of manageable pace. And the villain in both of these accounts is actually not an elite as such. It tends to be the baby boomers and the middle class, because they wanted infinite choice, and they wanted education to be much better rewarded. They wanted meritocracy to be the operating system of the country. And the result was a world that's materially better off than it was in the 1950s, but the benefits are extremely unequally spread. And people who want the benefits of that have to leave their home and their roots, particularly if they're out in the countryside, and they've got to adjust to this system where education is all important. And there's no longer a sense of unity, and change comes, and these people didn't want to go out to eat at Thai restaurants, followed by a Burmese restaurant, followed by a Peruvian restaurant. They wanted stability and predictability. So you see where I'm going with this. The world that we have is not necessarily the world the working class wanted, and America First tends to be a kind of catch-all label for a lot of change that people do not want or welcome.
You want me to take that? Yeah, no, I think you're right. And I am a little bit of a Lashian, all truth be told, who was this sort of curmudgeonly figure in history and social criticism. But a couple of things. One, that's a Keynesian world too, right? I mean, it's a world of where fundamental redistribution of wealth was part and parcel of economic policy, and I was thinking about your technology argument. The biggest strike in American history was in 1959, the U.S. Steel strike, which was about the introduction of technology. And how much technology, that they had to bargain over the introduction of technology. But I do think you're right, and I think it's confusing, especially for those that are left behind, right? Why people, my students always say, why don't people move out of those towns? And you're pitting, I think, the social, communal nature of human beings against the mobility of capital, and that tension is very difficult. So what we have is a geographic problem. Very dynamic, lively places where most of us live that are rich. And you have a Peruvian? Well, we don't have the Peruvian place yet, but
Just wait.
Yeah, I'll be first in line, unfortunately. But and so there's a book by a guy named Moretti about the geography of jobs. It's basically saying that we're living in two separate societies. It's sort of a revisit of the Kerner Commission, except on geography rather than race.
Mel, I think I want to recognize you. Yep.
Mike, I was wondering if you could explore for a few minutes the relationship between globalization and growing inequality. It seems to me that one of the sources of worker grievances, and a very legitimate one, is not simply that they're displaced from their jobs as capital flows overseas, but a perception, accurate in my view, that the profits of globalization are being maldistributed. That if you look at the profits and revenue of the corporations who have most benefited from globalization, the return to shareholders compared to the payment of the workforce, the gap has grown immensely over the last 10 or 20 years. At the same time, the gap between highest paid managers and corporate executives and the typical person working in a corporation has multiplied. That gap has multiplied exponentially. So part of this, workers feel aggrieved about this growing inequality, and they blame it on trade. So that's a framing issue. Politicians help them to think about it in terms of trade, and I think that Donald Trump is probably very happy to make people think of it in terms of trade. People who think otherwise, like yourself or President Obama or maybe Hillary Clinton, should be framing these issues quite differently, right? And talking about, well, if trade is not the issue, maybe it really is about the way corporate capitalism has been working. Maybe it really is the way that corporations distribute their profits. Maybe it is the way about the ways both the government and the corporate sector have demolished the power of labor unions. So I'd like you to sort of address those issues, both in terms of the relationship of inequality to globalization, and what are the mechanisms for redressing both the reality and the perception of grievance stemming from that.
So first, I think we should stipulate that the concern that people have about widening income inequality, along with the wage stagnation that Jeff referred to earlier, are completely real and legitimate concerns. And they are fact-based, and it does lead to the sense of resentment towards something. Now, whether, as you said, whether it's displaced, it should be more focused on automation or on globalization or on trade agreements themselves or on corporations and the way that they use the way they determine salaries or the way they use their capital to buy back stock for the benefit of shareholders, et cetera. That, I think, is a legitimate debate. I'd say two things in response. One is all of that, to me, points to the importance of having a robust domestic policy, which we don't have. And so one way that we could address both income inequality and the wage stagnation is actually to equip people with the skills they need to earn more, or with the capital they need to begin their own businesses, or with any number of other programs. And we're not particularly good at that in this country. Our transition assistance at the federal level, anyway, is really pretty lousy. Other countries do it better. Go to South Korea or Singapore or Scandinavia or Australia. They all have been quite open economies. They've had to go through major restructurings. Their labor force has been very much affected by globalization, and they've managed to keep up a strong consensus of free trade precisely because they've taken the domestic policies seriously in a way that we have not. So the answer is not to take actions, I think, that one, are likely to be ineffective in terms of trying to roll back globalization, and two, to the degree that they have an impact, is likely to be negative over the long run to those people. I mean, again, I'll just point to the most recent aluminum and steel tariffs. The debate going on in Washington is, will it kill 200,000 or 400,000 jobs net? No one's talking about job creation. It's all about how many jobs we're going to kill for the few that are going to be benefiting. So I think that's the real issue there. Second thing I would say is, let's widen the lens a little bit. I know this is a conference on America First, and we're here at one of the great first American universities. And there has been, of course, widening income inequality in the United States, wage stagnation in the United States, and in some of the other major industrialized countries. If you want to take one step back and look at the world, we have seen more convergence in terms of people being raised up out of abject poverty. I mean, more in this 1 or 2 generations of globalization than in the entire history of the human race. Right? It's really quite, and it's largely because of globalization, because they've been able to enter into the global economy, produce things to be sold in the global economy, and find themselves on a path. Now, we can say that's not our problem. We don't care that 300 million Chinese are no longer in abject poverty, or we don't care that 200 million Indians are no longer in abject poverty. But when we criticize globalization, we might want to take a step back and actually say, okay, you're right. It has affected American workers in a certain way, and it's affected workers all over the world in another way. And we may say that's the wrong trade-off. We don't care about that. We made a mistake. Or we can say, from the point of view of humanity, we need to address the problems of the United States, of the worker, and how they're affected by it. But we certainly don't want to go back to a world where 3 billion people are living on $1 a day or less. I don't think that's in our interest, even as a country.
I have Philip next, and then we'll come to Beth, and then to you, ma'am.
3 comments.
We've only got 8 minutes left, Philip.
Okay. The first is on wages. It helps to put that in historical perspective, that the era of high worker wages is also correlated to the shut off of foreign immigration, women out of the workforce, blacks kept out of the good jobs. So you triple the number of foreign-born in the population in 1 generation, bring 50 million women into the workforce, and open up good jobs to blacks, and you think that's going to have no effect on wages? So the demographics here are enormous and powerful and influential, and is also part of this history. Second comment. In the discussions of corporations and Mel's point about corporations taking profits, there's also quite a lot of insight from history about the way corporate ownership has changed in America. From publicly held corporations dominating the scene that often had significant stakes inside their communities in which their businesses operated, to actually now the majority of corporate ownership being in private equity forms that are increasingly operating on capital gains models outside the corporate profit system and are increasingly detached from the communities and their welfare. And the third and final comment is that the discussions on trade, and Jefferson's your own point about the nation state as the key agent, seems increasingly directed to a cultural conversation more and more disconnected from the reality of modern business. In the reality of modern business, yeah, there are global labor markets a piece, but global supply chains are a bigger piece, and global supply chains are about much more than global labor markets. So that when Donald Trump visits South Carolina in the 2016 campaign to stand in front of a Boeing 787 Dreamliner being assembled in South Carolina, he's standing in front of a plane that Boeing is selling to the world, most of whose components are made outside of the United States. When Apple imports its iPhone from China, 97% of the value of the iPhone actually isn't coming from China, and the Gorilla Glass in the front of it is made by a New York company that has fabrication facilities in Tennessee, Taiwan, and China, including in your home state, Jefferson, Springfield, Tennessee, which underscores, by the way, that globalization is not an elite phenomenon on the coasts. Globalization is all over rural America. whether it's in Springfield, Tennessee, where the Owens Corning plant is working, or it's in the GE Appliance Center in Louisville, Kentucky, Alabama, and also Tennessee, that is owned by the Chinese company Haier. And we could go on with dozens of examples like this, which brings then back to the point of, really is the nation state now the key agent? If you're concerned about global supply chains and the effect that has on increasingly everything we own, where in terms like imports and exports are no longer even meaningful words anymore, really can we only operate through single nation states as the agents for changing that world? In a way, Mike gets at this point a little bit with what he was trying to do in his work, but I think even Mike in his work was actually struggling, often vainly, to keep up with the business reality around him.
Do you want to take one more, or do you want to? I could do three quick phrases on each one, but if you
Please.
want to go.
No, go ahead.
I don't buy the first argument, the flooded labor market one. I think growth takes care of that, but I do think it is a question of countervailing power, what J.K. Galbraith called there's no levers on the system to redistribute what's accumulating at the top. I think I agree with your second argument. And the third one, I think supply chains are completely the story, but I don't understand why that negates the possibility of, when a bridge gets built in San Francisco, that it's actually, made with U.S., the contract could go to, a U.S. supplier of steel or whatever the case might be. And by the way, that Boeing factory moved from Seattle to escape the higher union contracts that the International Association of Machinists had when they were up there. Sorry.
Beth? Bailey? Yeah, Alfred?
I definitely need the microphone. My point was also demographic. I'm thinking the 1970s is a time when women and people of color are entering the workplace in larger numbers. And I don't see it as something that is just taken care of by growth, because it changes the meaning of work. So this sort of Lashian exchange between the two Jeffs brings up the problem of gender, and I know it's awkward, me being the only woman aside from Hilda who's spoken yet, to be the person who has to raise gender. But this notion of the stability sought by the working class presumes a white male working class, and for the possibilities to exist for women and for people of color, male and female and other, to enter is going to disrupt that stability. And so I think that this goes to the problem of the ways in which we keep, no matter what we say, disaggregating policy from the cultural meanings and the code words and such of America First, because policy will allow us to do that as we focus on trade, or whether growth will pull us out of the problem of the demographics. And I just don't think that the cultural responses can be separated that cleanly.
I'll leave culture to you, and then I'll go back to the supply chain.
Okay, that sounds good.
All right.
Yeah, you're better on supply chains, I'm probably better on culture. The 70s were a dual movement, right? You had the decline of the institutional power of both labor and workers generally in the Democratic Party. At the same time, you had the rise of the service sector and the diversity of workers, right? Women and minorities and post-EEOC employment. So, and that's kind of the tragedy, I think, of post-war labor history. And I don't think there's a cause and effect. That's my point. I think that they're kind of happening on separate tracks. If there is a cause, it is because white workers were resistant to change within their own institutions, and that's what I argued in Staying Alive. When I said growth will take care of that, I didn't mean that growth was the only engine that would change things. Believe me, that's not my thing.
I think just one comment on Philip's point on global supply chains. It's going to be really interesting to see how this evolves over time, and whether we're on the edge of a deglobalization period now. I think we've seen companies, for their own reasons, their own strategies, begin to shorten their supply chains, bring things back onshore. You also see, Jeff Immelt gave a speech a couple of years ago about localization. And in part because of the uncertainties around the global trading system, instead of building GE turbines here in the United States, where they're only going to sell a certain number of them, it's better to build them in India, where the customers are. And, with 95% of the global consumers outside the United States, 80% of the purchasing power outside the United States, and the fastest growth likely to be outside the United States, I'm not sure ultimately that plays to our strengths. If all of the American companies decide, well, we're, forget an open and liberal rules-based trading system, let's move our factory to China, India, where the markets are, that will likely be bad for American workers. And I think that's something that we may just begin to see be on the edge of there.
We have time for one more, ma'am. You had your hand up. No? We're covered.
Would you like to ask the final question, ma'am? Yes, Alfred, in the back? Sorry, you have to go all the way out to the other side.
It's fine.
I just wonder, we use the term over and over again here and elsewhere of a good job. And we kind of know what a good job is. A good job is one that's probably unionized and probably pays a very high hourly wage. The bad job is the job at Walmart where there are no unions and where more people are working than any other industry in the United States. And I just wonder if we sort of redefine what a good job is and redefine what a union can do and protect those jobs, we won't find there are more good jobs than we thought there were.
I'll make one comment on that while he's thinking about it. He says he's more knowledgeable. He has to go in deeper into the files than
Very generous interpretation.
than I do. Look, I think if we define good jobs as being private sector union jobs, then we certainly don't have very many of them left. Right, a few million?
Probably.
Yeah,
6.6% of the union labor force is unionized in the private sector.
In the private sector. So, but then you, I think to your point, begin to disaggregate, well, what does it mean to have a good job? And first of all, there may be some generational questions here. Millennials have a different idea of what a good job is than baby boomers. But I think one thing that we could probably all agree on is having a certain level of protection and benefits. And that goes to the portability of benefits. The future of this may not be unions negotiating with employers to have employer-based benefit schemes, but making sure whether it's health care or retirement or education, savings accounts, or whatever it is, that there are ways that workers, wherever they are in the economy, whether it's the gig economy or Walmart, or in a steel mill, can make sure and have security around the fact that they will have these benefits for life. And by the way, that gives them the flexibility to move from one employer to another or to be entrepreneurial. It's things that we're seeing a real problem in right now. By the way, that was one idea behind Obamacare. Like, at least take one piece of it, healthcare, and disaggregate it from the employer and say wherever you are in the economy, you will have access to healthcare.
Yeah, we agree. The only problem with it is if there is an admission that, okay, you have to save for college on your own or create a medical savings account or whatever it's going to be while the prices go through the roof, right? Where to attend my institution is more than the median annual income in America for 1 year. It's not sustainable. So we can provide those tools, but they're not always enough.
I'm just going to close by betraying my cosmopolitan internationalist credentials. These debates were held and more or less, I won't say resolved, but a pretty reasonable set of policies emerged in Europe in the late 19th century. That's how far behind our national conversation is. The idea that working people should have basic protections from the vagaries of the market was something that was understood and embraced and solved in late 19th century Germany, and then was embraced by the most capitalist, imperialist nation of all, Britain, before the First World War. That the idea that someone who got sick on the job should actually have a pension, or at least have some protection against unemployment, maybe even a pension insurance. Not a guaranteed job, but some protection, some basic protections. And of course, unions then moved into that space. So I just want to end on a global note to say that we are not alone in having these debates. We're just a little late to the party. All right. Thank you to our panelists very much.
Good luck, saving the world.